It's sometimes noted that it's impossible to be wrong about the contents of one's own experience. If someone tells us they are in pain, it's no good to respond that, no, you can't possibly be feeling any pain because your C fibers aren't firing in the right way. That isn't what it means to feel pain. We all encounter the world through our privileged access to the contents of our own consciousness, and no one else's. We are all alone together in our isolated universes of experience. The methods of science are exceptionally well tuned for questions involving quantities, number, volume, mass, velocity. But quantitative data tells us nothing about the felt qualities of experiences, what philosophers call their qualia. In the 18th century, Gottfried Leibniz proposed a thought experiment asking us to imagine a mechanical brain, a literal thinking machine. Now, imagine this mechanical brain enlarged to the size of a mill, large enough to walk inside and look around. Inside, you find mechanical components, physical parts performing physical functions. What you won't find is a single thought, emotion, or sensation of color. Over 300 years later, the intuition of Leibniz's mill holds. The most precise imaging of the human brain shows us no dreams, no fleeting moments of sadness or joy, and no felt sense of hope or purpose. Leibniz's point was that a physical description of the brain leaves out something important, the internal phenomenology, or inner sense of experience. David Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness. Why does a pattern of firing neurons feel like something at all? This problem isn't hard in the sense of simply being difficult. The problem is hard because we have no idea what an answer to these questions could possibly look like. Like Leibniz, Chalmers believes physicalists are leaving something important out of the story. Science cannot tell us what an experience feels like from the inside. A few thought experiments can help make the concept of qualia more concrete. Humans navigate the world primarily through the familiar senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. But nature provides other ways of experiencing the world, other sensory modalities for mapping our environment. Thomas Nagel asks us to consider what it's like to be a bat. Not to imagine doing bat-like things like hanging upside down in a cave, but what is it like for a bat to have experiences? What is being a bat like from the inside? Bats map the world primarily using sonar. Intuitively, this seems like a radically different way of interacting with the environment that should produce radically different experiences. Science can tell us about Doppler effects and echolocation, but what science can't provide us is an objective third-person description that brings us any closer to understanding the subjective first-person perspective of the world from a bat's point of view. Nagel's point is this: objective scientific description is simply the wrong tool for describing a subjective first-person experience. No scientific explanation, however sophisticated, can ever describe what it is like to be a bat. Nagel is making an essentially epistemological claim about the limits of what humans can know and communicate about the world. There simply is no vocabulary that can translate private subjective experiences into meaningful public language. Frank Jackson sharpens this point into an ontological claim, a claim about the world itself. In his Mary's Room thought experiment, Mary is the world's greatest color scientist. She knows every fact that a perfect science could discover about human color perception. But Mary has lived her entire life within a black and white room, and has never actually seen or directly experienced colors. One day, Mary leaves the room and sees a red rose for the first time. Has Mary learned a new fact? If Mary already knows every physical fact about color perception before actually encountering redness, then any new fact she learns upon leaving the room cannot, by definition, be a physical fact. The redness of the rose, its qualia, must represent a non-physical fact about the world. Therefore, Jackson concludes, reductive physicalism is false. There is simply more to the world than physical facts. Nagel and Jackson both demonstrate the hard problem of consciousness that Chalmers describes. If Mary can learn a new fact, and there is something that it's like to be a bat that science can't describe, then physicalism fails as a sufficient explanation for consciousness. Chalmers suggests that this failure indicates that some form of dualism must be true, but instead of Cartesian substance dualism, Chalmers advocates for a more moderate property dualism. The world is fundamentally physical, just as science describes it. But when physical systems reach certain levels of complexity, subjective mental properties emerge that cannot be explained by physical science. The work of philosophy, then, is to discover what laws might bridge the gap between physical brains and emergent mental properties. The picture that Nagel, Jackson, and Chalmers paint is one where the felt qualities of experience appear as internal phenomena, secured away from scientific measurement by the privileged access of the first-person subjective perspective. While the terminology has become more sophisticated and the arguments more subtle, there is more than a passing resemblance between Jackson's qualia, Locke's secondary qualities, and Russell's sense data. There is a suspicion that this is old wine served in a new bottle, and that we remain spectators trapped within a Cartesian theater watching a parade of epiphenomenal qualia dance across our mental screen. David Lewis offers an influential defense of physicalism against Jackson's black and white room argument. Leveraging Ryle's distinction between knowing that something is the case and knowing how to do something, Lewis argues that Mary doesn't learn a new physical fact when she leaves the room. Instead, Mary gains a new ability. This is known as the abilities hypothesis. Just like learning to ride a bicycle involves applying pre-existing skills of balance and coordination, seeing a new color involves a new application of pre-existing capacities of perception. There is disagreement as to whether Lewis successfully answers Jackson's challenge, but even if we successfully dispense with qualia, this might not be enough to preserve physicalism. Barbara Montero adds a further complication. We know what it means for something to be mental. We have direct experience of our feelings and sensations. And we have a clear sense of what is excluded from the mental, things like chairs and rocks. But what we lack is a clear sense of what it means to move from describing something as non-mental to describing it as physical, invoking a principle originally posed by Carl Hempel. Montero notes that the physical cannot refer to whatever is described by contemporary physics, because we know contemporary physics is incomplete. But we also can't use the physical to refer to some future physics, where all relevant questions have been settled, because by definition, we don't know what that future will look like. Given that we have a clearer sense of what we mean by the mental and the non-mental than what we mean by the physical and the non-physical, why should we feel that there is a mind problem that needs solving, rather than a body problem? There is an alternative route that seems to avoid both the mind problem and the body problem. What if both matter and mind are built into the foundations of nature itself? Chalmers and Montero have both gestured in this direction, and the later work of Nagel endorses it outright. Nagel asks, what if matter is simply how the world appears when viewed from the third-person perspective, from the outside, and mind is simply that same world viewed from the first-person perspective, from the inside? This view, known as Panpsychism, has historical roots in the works of William James, Bertrand Russell, and Alfred North Whitehead. Panpsychists consider consciousness to be a brute fact about the nature of the universe. Every particle, from the Big Bang onward, has possessed at least some rudimentary form of proto-experience. Panpsychism has experienced a recent revival in both philosophy and cognitive science, in part because it dissolves the mind-body problem entirely. There is no mystery to solve and no dualism to heal. Matter and minds are simply alternative descriptions of the same fundamental reality. While Chalmers and Lewis disagree about the reality of qualia, they share a foundational assumption. Regardless of whether color experiences represent qualia or perceptual abilities, the mental processes that give rise to them are describable, more or less completely, in terms of the functions they perform. If a computer followed an algorithm that accurately simulated all the inputs and internal processes of a physical brain, then it should produce the same experiences of color, joy, and purpose that a human brain experiences. The fact that the mind program happens to be implemented in meat rather than silicon is ultimately incidental. It's the mental program itself that matters. We will return to this idea in the next lecture, and I'll see you there.